Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I spoke with Mark Enser, who is a former HMI, which stands for His Majesty's Inspector, very British, and Ofsted's National Lead for Geography. Before that, Mark was a teacher for nearly 20 years and is now working in school support as well as being a freelance writer and speaker. My first introduction to Mark and his work was through Christian Moore Anderson, who you may be familiar with from our previous episode. And that was about a blog titled A Pedagogy for Powerful Knowledge: Why Dialogue, Inquiry, and Cognitive Science Aren't Competing Answers. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I enjoyed the blog piece because it's near and dear to my heart in thinking about how we should and could combine those things and what happens when we don't do those things well. So we touched on all of those things and much more. I'd also like to remind you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, for more information about our professional learning and professional development services, as well as more podcast episodes and blog pieces and other resources. I'm also excited to announce that we have the next evolution of our successful PBL Grow series. For a number of years, we have been doing our PBL Grow events in the summer, and PBL Grow 26 was great. So we are now offering a knowledge-rich inquiry 2-day event, October 26th and 27th. That is titled Inquiry Grow 26. And you can find more information on that by going to wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see information and a link along the top banner. If you have any questions about that or anything else, feel free to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here is the conversation with Mark. I'm with Mark Enser, and Mark is joining me from the UK. We're going to talk about one of his blog pieces on Substack, and we'll get into the details of that. It was shared with me by Christian Moore Anderson, who was a podcast guest previously, the most recent podcast before this one. But before we get into that, Mark, I want to welcome you and give you an opportunity to give a little background on who you are, what you do, how you got there, and all that good stuff.
Okay, I'll do my best. So my name's Mark Enser. I was a geography teacher for about 20 years here in the UK. Then I left teaching to join Ofsted, which is our school inspectorate service. I was a HMI, so one of His Majesty's Inspectors of Schools, and I was also their national geography lead. So I spent 2.5 years or so going into schools, carrying out inspections, but also looking at what makes effective geography teaching across the country, and also looking at how you inspect what makes effective geography teaching across the country. So that was an interesting role.
I bet.
And then, yeah, you see a lot, which helps.
Yeah, if I'm to believe social media, Ofsted is some sort of a devil or Satan or some version of that, right?
Yeah, it's complicated. I think most people agree that Ofsted's probably not what anyone would want. It's not what anyone would create if we were building an inspectorate from scratch, but no one can quite agree on what it should look like instead.
Yeah, well, we won't shoot the messenger here.
That'll be nice, thank you. But once I left that, I've spent the last couple of years doing freelance work, so a lot of writing, working on curriculum resources in America, Australia, New Zealand, and here in the UK, supporting schools, writing textbooks, and talking to interesting people like you.
Well, hopefully I can live up to that billing. Otherwise, we'll get you the best doctors to treat you. So just a little bit of background. I assume you went to school in the UK, but what was that experience like? How would you describe it? Was it a bit more traditional, a bit less traditional, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, actually, looking back, because I'm aware that when I look back now, I'm looking back with my current mind. So I'm always a little bit hesitant to trust how much I remember of my own schooling, because I'm re-remembering it, I'm adding in new context and things like that. For my secondary school, I remember there being a real mix. So some lessons probably were more traditional. You might think of as more traditional, with a teacher explaining things, modeling things, then us doing practice and so on. So maths, for example, is probably fairly traditional. But other subjects, the humanities, I think of social studies, there was a lot of aimless discussion where we'd kind of sit around and be given some kind of provocation to talk about. So we're learning about Native American and the US history. What do you think? And we just kind of sit around and share some views on it, and it wouldn't go anywhere very much. And then we do the best we could when we came to the exam. So I think it was kind of a bit of a mix, really. I don't think there was any particular driving principles behind it. I think it was a collection of teachers finding their own way, teaching their subject as they saw fit. And I don't know it's that different now, to be honest.
Right. I think you're probably right about that. And then your, I guess your teacher preparation program, what was that like? How would you describe that?
Intense. So in the UK, most secondary school teachers, it's a year's program. So we do kind of our 3 years of our undergraduate degree, and then you do can do a postgraduate certificate of education, which is kind of a year higher level qualification, and then you get your qualified teaching status as you're doing it. Most of that time spent in school, so doing teaching practice. So most of that year I was in 2 different schools, and you kind of slowly increase your teaching load, taking on more responsibility for classes and things over those 2 years. And then some of the time was spent in university, where in theory you were taught how to teach. But again, looking back, so we're going back some kind of 24, 25 years now, there wasn't very much really on how to teach. There's a lot of kind of curriculum theory, a lot of Piaget and Vygotsky and kind of various educational theorists, but very little that translated to what do I do in the classroom on a Monday morning, or how do I teach that group of 13-year-olds Friday after lunch? What's that going to look like in practice? That was largely left to people to work out for themselves, I think. So there was a bit of a disconnect, and I know over the years there's been some improvements there in teacher education. There's been a kind of greater focus on classroom practice, which has been really good to see. But it's a tricky one. I don't think there's ever really enough time to try and do all of this in a year. Something's always going to have to give.
Yeah, I mean, it's as I tend to often say, it's about trade-offs, right? There's lots of instructional decisions, and I don't want to get into the weeds on teacher prep because it'll take up the whole podcast. But it strikes me, my oldest daughter is in teacher prep now to be an elementary teacher, and so interesting to see it from that perspective. As obviously I went through teacher prep, and most teachers don't tend to think very highly of the teacher prep. But I wonder too, because while I think that there's a real justification for more sort of cognitive science and some of those things that you mentioned in teacher prep, one of the things that strikes me is that it's, first of all, if maybe there was some of that, maybe not the same language or whatever, that people just didn't recognize and didn't see as sort of cognitive science or science of learning. Maybe not. I'm probably overstating that, but also, like, one of the things that is a reality about teaching is that it's so hard to make meaning of any of those principles until you're actually doing the things, until it's the afternoon with those 8th graders or whatever. So there's a bit of a conundrum there, teaching those principles without the actual reflective practice and sort of canvas on which to sort of play with there and make meaning of things. You could learn those things as sort of knowing them. And I think it's maybe a good segue into your blog piece here, is like, what are the ways in which we actually transfer or convert those things into practice? So let's get into the blog piece. So you have a Substack. It's called Teaching It Real. We'll put the link in the show notes. The one that the piece that caught my attention was shared with me is A Pedagogy for Powerful Knowledge: Why Dialogue, Inquiry, and Cognitive Science Aren't Competing Answers. And this is near and dear to my heart because I have lots of conversations with people and sort of debates, discussions, arguments. I try to make them more discussions, but people like to think of them as debates, which I think is maybe a fundamental problem in what we're doing here. But I'm gonna put you on the spot here, because your first line is, "Here's a guess about you reading this. You're probably already on a side." And my assumption is that you're sort of trying to get people to stop taking sides. But how would you describe yourself as a teacher? Would it be more in the sort of cognitive science of learning? I mean, I've written and sort of have a spectrum of pedagogy, sort of traditional and progressive on either ends, and lots of spaces in between. So how would you describe your thinking about teaching and learning?
It's a really good question, and I think my answer might have changed over the years. I think when I think about my own teaching over those kind of 20 years or so, I'd definitely say I was more in that kind of traditional camp. I far more of the sage on the stage than the guide by the side. I think I can really see a lot of value in things that are put forward by people like Barak Rosenshine, which we will hear about a lot now, and people like Sweller and Kirshner. I could see that in my classroom, and I could see the benefit to my students when I started adopting more of those approaches. So I think philosophically, I think I come from a more kind of traditional background, but I think I hope the argument I was making in that piece was that kind of traditional approach to teaching, embracing things like Rosenshine's principles of instruction or the work of people like Sweller on cognitive load theory, doesn't mean that you don't use disciplined inquiry. It doesn't mean that you don't use dialogic teaching. It helps you to use those things well. And if you're just saying, oh no, I believe in the benefits of cognitive science, therefore there is no dialogue in my classroom, or therefore we don't do any disciplined inquiry, you're missing the point, and you're missing quite a few tricks that could really benefit your students and could benefit you in the long run. So I'd say I'm probably a lowercase t traditionalist when it comes to teaching.
Mm-hmm. And so how, because it sounds like you've shifted, and we're going to explore, the thinking that you're put forward in this blog, but how would you, why, what sort of prompted that shift?
I think just reading, reflecting, and visiting so many schools and working with so many schools over the years. I think when I started I think one useful framing is to go back to something like the three futures model. I think when I started teaching, I was very much in a kind of future two mindset, which is that kind of very progressive. There's no such thing as objective truth. Everyone has to learn things for themselves. Children are the best people to teach themselves things. And that was how we were taught to teach. And I really kind of bought into that whole scale. Was, I want to try and limit how much I'm talking, just get the kids doing things. They'll learn, they'll develop their own knowledge from what comes within. And it didn't work. And over the years, I could see that just wasn't working. And as I started to read more about education and educational theory, my view shifted, and probably shifted much more towards the kind of future one model, which was much more about actually, no, there is objective knowledge, and we just want to pass that on from me as a teacher to you as a pupil. And that idea of that just kind of transference of, I have this knowledge about geography that I want you to have, so I will tell you it, you will hear it, and then you will have that knowledge. And I probably lent much more into that model. And that worked to an extent. It certainly helped to improve exam outcomes, kind of having that in mind, because you went, well, this is what's on the spec. So if I tell you it and you repeat it over and over again, you can reproduce enough of that in the exam to do much better. So that was good. That was kind of successful. But then as I started to explore the idea of powerful knowledge more, and thinking about the work of people like Muller and Young, and what knowledge is for and what knowledge enables pupils to do, you can see where that's not sufficient. The ability to just reproduce knowledge isn't enough. You want them to understand it enough to be able to do something more with it themselves, to give them capabilities to understand the world better than you do, to be able to put things together in new and novel ways and propose solutions, imagine alternative futures. That's what I want from education. And to do that, you have to do more than just get them to remember the things that you've said. You have to get them to think about it more deeply and make richer connections to things. Then I read something that Margaret Roberts wrote, I think back in 2014. She was reflecting on powerful knowledge and taking a somewhat critical view of it. And she was saying that, well, if we are going to have powerful knowledge as a curriculum idea, then it only works if we also have a powerful pedagogy. and that there has to be more of a dialogue between curriculum and pedagogy. And it's not enough to just create this beautiful kind of curriculum that sits there inert on the page somewhere. We have to have teachers who know how to deliver it in a way that lands. But the more I read and the more I looked, I couldn't really see anyone developing that idea. Lots of people writing about powerful knowledge, lots of people writing about their views on pedagogy, but no one kind of linking the two. So that's the work I've been doing over the last couple of years, is trying to find those connections and trying to find the pedagogy that would support that kind of view of education.
Mm. Yeah, so I'm going to try to explore some areas in which we might disagree, because there's so many of the things you're saying are resonating and resonant with the work that I do. Although I'm coming at it probably from a bit of a flip perspective, right? I would sort of style myself a bit more progressive, and certainly an advocate of inquiry, with an I. I don't know why you put an E in front of it, but that's a whole other podcast. We can dive into that, but one thing that we do a lot of project-based learning work, and one thing that I've come to, or sort of shifted on my position, at least rhetorically, is that that sort of end of the spectrum that's more inquiry, constructivist, progressive, PBL, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think there is a mistake, and I'm very sharply critical of folks in that area that dismiss the importance of knowledge or explicit teaching and talk about it in ways that, well, if we just sort of create the conditions, they will figure it out. There's the potential of that, but the probability is not very high. And, even Howard Gardner, who I had on this podcast, was, he said, we've been too idealistic, and we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about that, and maybe pay attention to more of the probability than the potential, but keeping both in mind, right? And I think that's a bit of the sort of conundrum here. So kind of working through your blog piece, and you're talking about potential knowledge being potentially powerful, and people say knowledge is power, and I think that's a not quite right. It's knowledge is necessary but not sufficient, and you've used some of that terminology, right? So how do we make it powerful? We get to that understanding and the making of meaning of whatever that knowledge is. So one of the sections in here is your thesis. I would sort of summarize it, but I'm thinking you can probably do a better idea or a better job of summarizing that thesis that you've got here. And you've done a little bit, but if you can kind of package it up for us a little bit.
The thesis of that blog post about the pedagogy for powerful knowledge. I think the thesis would be that to make the powerful knowledge accessible or even available for pupils, we need a blend of cognitive science approaches, dialogic teaching, and inquiry learning. And the three things support each other. And if you take one of them away, the others start to collapse. So if you try to have inquiry-based learning or project-based learning, but you don't have the knowledge to engage with it meaningfully, that's where you get those very kind of superficial answers, because people just don't know enough to form their own ideas, to make their own decisions, to do something meaningful. They have to have that knowledge available to them. And similarly with something like dialogic teaching, I think the work of Robin Alexander is fascinating on dialogic teaching. And his work on the 5 country studies looking at it found that dialogic teaching was richest in the countries that had a tradition of much more didactic teaching, which seems quite ironic and kind of startling. Was actually the didactic teaching led to more dialogue because the pupils had the knowledge to engage in dialogue with. So those things work together. And then in order to have meaningful inquiry, well, inquiry works well when you do it as a group, and you aren't just discussing as a group and just saying, well, I think, well, I disagree, I think, well, I think, well, I think, but actually saying, oh, because you think this, I now think that, or because you think that, I'm now going to have to challenge you with this piece of evidence. And so if you get that kind of meaningful dialogue going, that inquiry becomes richer. So I think that's the thesis, is those three things: cognitive science, dialogue, and inquiry are needed and that they work together, not in opposition to each other.
All right. And again, very resonant with the work that we do and what I'm trying to sort of further. So the part one, it gets into the dialogue, the dialogic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you can unpack, you did it in the blog piece, unpack a little bit here, the differences and distinctions between discussion and dialogue and why they're important. What are the distinctions that make a difference? And maybe to add a bit of a wild card here, one of the things that I really want to focus on in this podcast, and I think is maybe something that is related here, is dialectic, right? So how do we figure out what's true? And I think there's obviously some overlap there. So maybe you can color inside the lines with that dialectic.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So I think to come back to the first one, the idea of the difference between dialogue and discussion, to my mind, discussion is something that humans do. I don't think we need to be taught to discuss. I think, we're social creatures as we're raised and socialized. It's something that happens.
So it's biologically primary.
There we go. Yeah, to kind of previous ideas, absolutely. That kind of biological primary idea that we just learn to discuss, and that's how we operate as social creatures. Dialogue, on the other hand, is something that you get better at with training, support, and guidance. So I really like things like Socratic question stems. I think they can be really helpful to help pupils understand how to enter into dialogue, either with someone else or even just with an idea. So getting them to look at an issue, form an opinion, but then to start asking questions like, why do I hold this view? Who would disagree with me? What evidence would change my mind? Which I think is one of the most powerful questions we should be asking politicians and everyone else. You hold this view, okay, but what would make you hold a different view? What would you need to convince you that your view is incorrect? Because if they don't know, or they say, well, nothing, then they're probably not entering into the discussion or dialogue with good faith. We need to have something that allows us to change our mind. So I think those kind of question stems are really helpful. So I think dialogue is more structured, it's guided, and it's taught. And then we learn how to kind of enter into this kind of dialogue. And it leads to richer learning, because it encourages us to consider what we know and to think about what we know and to think about it in different ways. And every time we have to think about something, we learn it better. We come back to our ideas of cognitive science, that memory is the residue of thought, kind of foundational touchstone of cognitive science.
Right, retrieval.
And dialogue, yeah. And cognitive science forces us to, and dialogue forces us to do that. It forces us to think hard about the matter. And I don't know that discussion does. I think we can have a discussion without having to think very hard about it. So we can just talk in platitudes. We can nod along while someone else is talking, and we don't really have to engage in the material. So I think that's an important distinction, and one that's worth thinking about in the classroom, because we know there's very little discussion or dialogue in most classrooms in the US and in the UK. We're not very good at it generally. It tends to be the teacher is talking, the pupils are writing. And when pupils are talking, it tends to be just to ask very procedural questions. Should I start the next question? Have I finished? Can I go home now? That tends to be all you really hear. It's not really questions about the subject matter. And so quite often teachers are encouraged to put more discussion into their classroom to get pupils talking. But that advice on its own isn't very helpful. Just talking how and about what is the thing that teachers then need support and guidance on, because talk for its own sake doesn't do very much. Nothing does.
Right. Can be in some ways performative, right? Yeah. And the dialectic piece, for what I think about, and I'll make the pitch here, one of the synergy of the three things you're talking about: cognitive science, inquiry, and dialogue. Whatever that looks like, one thing I think is true is that our classrooms, at least in Western society, should be more focused on things like dialectic and figuring out, okay, so this is what somebody says is true, and that's knowledge, but is it true? What would make it true, and all those kinds of things. And I come from a social studies background, and one of my side projects is really sort of how can we get the K-12 realm, at least here in the States, to sort of regrow some of those Enlightenment liberal principles. And epistemology is really a big part of that, right? How do we figure out what's true? And to me, that's dialectic, that's dialogue, that's pushing and saying, all right, what would make that true? And what makes you say that? Sort of, we call them facilitative questions that, drawing on the work from Project Zero from Harvard, making thinking visible. Like, how do we get that thinking that's in students' heads out as teachers so that we can work with it? And, it's a rabbit hole of formative assessment and formative action, all those kinds of things. But that's different from just discussion, right? Of just sort of tossing about ideas and really not doing anything with them. So I'm not sure if you have any, sort of follow-up thoughts on any of that.
I think it's a really interesting point. It brings me back to the idea of those three futures. Future three, the idea of powerful knowledge, is based on the idea that academic subjects are all about striving for truth. That's what they're set up to do. They're trying to discover truth about the world, whether that's mathematical truths, geographical truths, scientific truths. That's what they're doing. And that future three powerful knowledge approach to the curriculum doesn't just say that knowledge is objective facts that we transfer onto the pupils, but is about giving them the power to question those facts and to understand how that knowledge was created, but also how it's contested. So I think in my own subject, in geography, if we present a geographical model to pupils, it should be with a view to critique it. So something like the Burgess model, as a way of showing how cities develop over time in the different urban zones, is almost certainly wildly out of date. It was based on a handful of Western cities. It barely applies to them anymore. It certainly doesn't apply to cities around the world. But pupils need to have a knowledge of what the Burgess model is and how it's supposed to work in order to critique it, and then to be able to enter into dialogue with each other to pull it apart and to say, well, here's just some evidence of neo-colonial ideas that are being used around the world, and then can kind of critique it. But if they don't have that knowledge to begin with, then that kind of dialectic falls flat, because without that knowledge, you can't question and try to reach for some kind of truth, because
Right.
What are you basing it on?
Yeah, and the assertion that I hear regularly, you've probably heard, is you can't think critically without knowledge, which I think is not quite right. You just can't think very well, or the depth of critical thinking would be limited, highly limited. And I think that's what you're getting at there, right? You could do some analysis or evaluation, which I would put in critical thinking, but once the addition of knowledge helps with the depth of any of that, and I think that's important. You do a really nice job of giving some examples in the blog piece in different subject areas. But one of the things I wrote down, and if you're talking about the dialogue piece, is talking about history. And one thing that I have found as a sort of thread of a lot of the sort of loudest cognitive science of learning advocates is that they seem to be coming from a math perspective. And math seems to be different in so many ways from social studies or humanities or English, right? Where there aren't as many, and maybe there aren't any sort of open-ended kinds of questions, right? The ways in which we might say, does the executive branch in the United States have too much power? That's an open-ended question. But math tends to be, this is an answer, right? Like, it's much more concrete. So does this is a rhetorical question, but does your thesis apply less to math than it does to social studies or humanities or something a little bit more open-ended?
So an interesting question. I suspect so. I think math, or maths as we call it, again, for no particular reason, is unique. And it's one thing that we find in schools a lot, is that quite often we'll have school leaders who come from a maths background, and they're out amazed that all of their ideas don't work when they try to apply them across the school. So assessment in maths looks nothing like assessment in any other subject, and things like this. It just doesn't work at all. I think another one is modern foreign languages. It's such a different subject. It doesn't quite apply to other things. But I think the kind of thesis that I'm putting forward, I think social studies, large parts of English literature, science. I think it works. But I think there's it's almost all of education. I think there will be exceptions where it's less applicable, because in those ones it's about practicing a skill to fluency. And there's something in there still about understanding why the rule is there, and there's a room for dialogic teaching there. So why am I carrying out this procedure in that way? Is there a better way to carry out that procedure? What happens if I try to change it? So that there's kind of something there still to be thinking about and grappling with, as well as just learning what the procedure is by doing it a lot as part of maths education. But it's less significant. You get better at maths, you get better at language by practicing it a lot until you can do it fluently.
Yeah, and I think there's probably there are different camps of thinking about math, right? There's the sort of science of learning camp that I've sort of described, which is really focused on knowing and fluency and those kinds of things. And then there's perhaps something more like Jo Boaler's work, which is more conceptual. And she was on a recent podcast talking about Paul Black's legacy, and hoping to have her on solo to kind of explore some of those things. But yeah, it really does strike me as such an interesting, because the people that I sort of argue with or discuss with, I'm trying to have discussion again, dialectic, but a lot of them seem to come from that sort of math background, and they're and sometimes even science, like the instructional hierarchy and the reversal or expertise reversal effect. And like, they're so locked in on those things, that it's almost impossible for them or seems impossible for them to sort of think differently about how inquiry or dialogue might be used in ways to further some of those pieces. And again, they may not be interested in some of those outcomes that inquiry and dialogue can deliver. And I think that's a part of it too, right? Is like, what are we trying to achieve? What are our goals? And then what are the ways in which we get there with the most effectiveness? And that's a different kind of conversation between some of the people. And I think math people tend to have perhaps a little bit different set of goals and outcomes.
I think you're probably right. And I think everything comes back to intent. So some of the work that we did at Ofsted all those years ago, when the previous framework came out for inspecting schools, was saying that with quality of education, what we need to look at are the 3 I's. We look at intent first. What is the curriculum designed to do? Then you look at implementation. How are you getting towards that intent? And then you look at the impact. Does it work? And I think you have to have that intent first. Otherwise, you can't design the implementation, because the implementation has to be led by the intent. That's absolutely right. So if maths are trying to create a different outcome, then their implementation has to look very different. And if an individual maths teacher wants a different outcome, it's going to look very different. So what I'm writing about is very much from a future 3 powerful knowledge approach. And I think that's quite clear in the post. He says, if we're going to have powerful knowledge, we need a pedagogy that supports it. Well, if you say, well, I don't think powerful knowledge is important or useful as a concept, don't read on. This isn't for you. This doesn't make any sense. So, don't, in it, if you're future 1 or future 2, if you're going from a very kind of progressive pupils learn for themselves, you don't need this. If you're going for, I just want instruction that pupils remember and can reproduce, you don't need this.
Yeah. When there's an argument, or somebody says, well, this is the way to do it, and I say, well, it depends, and it's kind of getting at what you're saying there. And that's another wrinkle, is that I don't think we should have any one group dictating what the outcome has to be, right? So, that's why we have different schools and we have different approaches and that kind of thing. Well, let's get into the inquiry piece. So you cite the work of Paul Kirshner and Sweller, and I've had both of them on the podcast, and I find their work really useful. I think it's important. One of the things that I am frustrated by in that work tends to be the conflation of inquiry with discovery. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, is the importance of, it's not that because minimal guidance is, that's the language that was used in the research and the paper and all that kind of thing, which is something more like discovery. But it's really a matter of the guidance. And so it's not that we shouldn't use inquiry, but that we should use it in a way that is not minimally guided. It should not be discovery, at least in most cases. So kind of unpack that piece, if you would.
Yeah, so if I think about my own subject, because it's the one that I'm the expert in, so I think about something like geography. In the UK, at the end of year 13, so when pupils are 18, leaving kind of high school education, they complete a non-examined assessment, which is a piece of coursework that they take complete control over. They have to come up with their own question, a geographical question that aligns to the specification. They have to work out what data they need to gather, then go and gather it. They have to present that data and work out how to present it, how to do their own analysis, how to reach their own conclusion, and how to evaluate that conclusion. That's at 18, at the end of 13 years of formal education. And I think the mistake that we've made in the past is saying, well, that's what pupils should be doing from year one. You know, this is the pedagogy that's going to lead to these kinds of outcomes, is getting pupils to create their own questions and get their own information and write it all up and present it and so on and so on. But there's a reason we do that at 18 at the end of this process, is because you have to get a huge amount of knowledge and understanding of the subject in order to reach that point. And if you're going to use that approach further down in the school, that's where it has to be highly structured. So you might have to give them the question, but then start explaining, well, why is this a good geographical or historical or scientific question? You know, why are we using this as a question? And then either giving them the data they need or supporting them with getting that information and presenting it and unpacking it with them and looking at it. And then if we're going to present it, think, well, how are we going to present it and why do we present it in this way and not that way? And so all these stages need to be taught. But the process of going through those stages is still really useful for them generating learning, of asking good questions, gathering data, presenting it, analyzing it, and so on. It's just that they need support with each of those stages, and that support can then fade over the years until they really can do it themselves. So we want the pedagogy of inquiry, of people's thinking deeply, looking at information, finding answers from the information, not just being presented with the final answer, because we forget that. But going through the process of thinking hard helps us to learn it. They just need the support and need the scaffolds in place.
So would you, would your advocacy land, where would it land in terms of when and where inquiry should be introduced? And I ask this, so I think that there's a reasonable case, and this is something I advocate for inquiry first. But what I think cognitive science and sort of science of learning advocates, the mistake that they're making there is that they're assuming that inquiry first means, something like productive struggle, which is unproductive because, as you mentioned, they don't know enough, right? So it's not that we're using inquiry at the first to give them just like, see if you can figure it out kind of thing, but it's a sort of framing, a priming. When I talked with, I think Jim Heel and Rebecca Berlin about mental models, like, can you use an inquiry question? You've got a question here, how and why might climate migration shape the future of cities? Starting your unit with that sort of framing question that might give something like a mental model, a conceptual map. We talk about sort of hooks on which to hang your knowledge, and the way that I think about using inquiry in that way is starting like that, and maybe doing a bit of thinking like, okay, so what are the things I'm thinking about here? Like, let me just kind of get my head wrapped around this conceptually, knowing that I really don't have any, I'm not expected to come up with the answers at this point. And that's not the purpose of this exercise here, but it's to, again, sort of create some conceptual map and an idea, and then identify what are the things we would need to know, right? What is the knowledge that's necessary here? And that's one of the features of project-based learning in our work is what's that need to know list, and that should be reflective of the content and the knowledge. And then of course you teach it, and often using explicit teaching, you're building that knowledge. So you're sort of starting at the macro, coming back down to the micro as you're going through and building that knowledge. And it would be consistent with that instructional hierarchy of your acquisition phase and that kind of thing. And then sort of flowering out and growing back to the macro, because now as you have that additional knowledge that you've identified you need to know, now you're starting to put the pieces together, and you've got that conceptual map because you started with that inquiry piece. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Exactly as you put forward. I'd advocate doing it with from the kind of pupils at the youngest age, and then working through their education. I think it's in some ways it's a curriculum approach that allows you to build a really strong curriculum. So starting with an overarching question for a topic is really useful because it helps to give a boundary to the topic. One of the big problems that we have in schools is we have limited time, and we say, okay, we're going to be looking at US history. What about you? You know, it's vast, it's huge. Whereas if we have a specific question we're trying to answer, why did X happen in year whatever, or, you know, whatever that question is. Okay, now we've got a question, we've got a boundary to the curriculum. Now we can start to populate and say, okay, so in order to answer that question, what knowledge do we need pupils to have? What do they need to be able to do to understand, to be able to answer that bigger inquiry question? Well, now we can plan out our sequence of lessons that keep coming back to that question. And it helps pupils to understand where their learning journey is going. So I'm learning this today because it's going to help me to answer that big question. And then at the end of the lesson, I can reflect back, okay, what do I know now? What do I now understand? And that's going to give those, that you're going to give them that hook, as you mentioned, somewhere to put that knowledge, somewhere to put that information, and they start to build a bigger picture. So I would use that kind of inquiry approach with pupils who are very young, because the problem is never with the inquiry process. The problem is with unstructured inquiry. The problem is that what happened in a lot of schools, and I've seen it myself, I've done it myself early in my career, was it became go and find it out for yourself. So we're going to do inquiry-based learning. I've booked the computer room. We're going to sit in front of a computer. Here's the question. Go and answer it. And they just, whatever comes into Google is then their answer. Yeah. And that's it. And they haven't learned anything. So they don't understand what they're asking, and they don't understand what they're reading. So I think that's the problem. It was never with inquiry. It was unstructured inquiry. And that's why I quite like the idea of discipline inquiry. So geographical inquiry, historical inquiry, because it makes the distinction a bit clearer that we're following what the subject does, not just a kind of generic go find for yourself.
Yeah, and you know, that gets into sort of thinking like a historian or a mathematician or whatever. So what are the kinds of questions that someone might ask? And again, that's one of the reasons why I think project-based learning can be really helpful, is because you ostensibly are interacting with folks who have that sort of expertise. You know, maybe you're bouncing your ideas off of engineers, and they would ask questions in ways that you hadn't thought of because you're not an engineer, but you're learning, right? And so we're not asking them to act as experts, but to start thinking like experts think. And that, I think, is a distinction that sort of science of learning, quote unquote, often seems to miss and uses as a sort of cudgel. And I just as a sort of side note, that development and sort of modeling of, let's think about what we would need to know in order to answer this question about climate or whatever it might be. To me, that's a really important move that, you know, really just explicit instruction alone misses out on, because when students become adults, they're not going to have the teacher who has the knowledge and says, these are the things we need to know. We will be faced with novel challenges and problems as adults, and even before adults. And so can we effectively identify the things we need to know and the questions we need to ask? And I think that that's essential, something that crystallizes over time. And so when I hear people say, well, we should only do inquiry, you know, at the later ends of K-12 experience, that kind of thing. So, well, you've missed out on the opportunity. And it's not that we're using inquiry to build knowledge. We're using inquiry to sort of synergistically, as you sort of mentioned. But then, you know, I think it's important to recognize, and maybe you want to sort of add to this, is the problem of inquiry without knowledge is just something that end of the spectrum just has to reckon with.
I think it is. I think you can't have inquiry without knowledge, but you also, if you have knowledge without the ability to inquire, then it's inert. If you can't apply the knowledge, you can't do something with it, then you're going to lose it really quickly because you're not thinking with it. It just sits there on a page. You're not applying it. You're not using it. You're not developing any capabilities through it. so it doesn't become ingrained. And that's why when you look back in your school days and you go, oh God, I can't remember anything that I was taught about, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that's because you never had to apply the thing and do the real kind of meaningful thinking that leads to those lasting changes. So
Yeah.
the relationship works both ways. So you need both.
So let's get into the cognitive science piece because we're running out of time. And again, I think cognitive science is really important, and I think the inquiry and progressive end of the spectrum should think about it more. But it's got some limits, and I think a lot of the folks in that camp and that advocacy camp would do well. And one of my worries is that they tend not to recognize some of the important distinctions and sort of pitfalls and limitations, and instead say, this is the way you should teach, and these are the outcomes you should be after. And I think the danger in there is not only that it's limiting learning, but it's also limiting the potential success of cognitive science, which is in the end a problem, right? So cognitive science is important, and we should be thinking and criticizing that process and that, those ideas in ways that will help further it. But you say cognitive science isn't a checklist, performance is not the same as learning. Unpack the cognitive science piece here.
Yeah, I think that's it, really, isn't it? There's a huge amount that I've taken from it over the years. It really did help to transform the way that I taught. I think it was the book Making Every Lesson Count that I picked up first shortly after it was published. Sean Allison and Andy Tharby. Brilliant book, kind of exploring the ideas of cognitive science in a really meaningful way that you could apply in the classroom. And it was just things that I'd never really been taught. It wasn't a feature of in school training, at the time, it is now hugely, but at the time, it was just kind of completely ignored. It just opened my eyes that actually there was this vast amount of research out there that teachers could be tapping into that could transform how we teach. So things like, retrieval practice, which now is just second nature in schools and second nature to teachers, just wasn't something that we really did. It was really frowned upon. The idea of starting a lesson with a quiz was so kind of old school and archaic. No one would dare do something like that. Whereas now we barely see a lesson that doesn't begin with some kind of quiz. But I think what happened, and this was something a lot of us started warning about quite early on and writing about and reflecting on, was these practices very quickly were then rushed into schools because they were effective. Doing retrieval practice really helps kids to remember things. But then they became kind of ossified. And it became, you have to do a quiz, and you have to do it in this way, and you have to do one question from last term, and one question from last week, and one from last lesson. But then there was no thought into, well, what should those questions be? How should pupils answer them? Why are we asking those types of questions and getting them to do it in this way? Because the practice had become everything. So we get that kind of cargo cult approach to teaching where it just becomes mimicking the practice. Let's do the thing that's been held up as a good example rather than really understanding the principle that sits behind it. And I think that's probably where we've come to with some cognitive science. And you see things like dual coding being massively misapplied and just becoming a huge dead end. Retrieval practice to an extent. Say, we've mentioned some of the potential weaknesses with the way that the idea of avoiding minimal guidance and the lesson that we've taken from that has then been misapplied and led to some problems in practice. So I think that's kind of the pitfall, really, is when cognitive science became a list of practices you had to perform rather than some principles it helped to understand.
Yeah, I've framed it, and others have framed it as well, as useful probably more as heuristic than algorithm. And there's a number of people, at least the rhetoric that they use seems much more algorithmic. And retrieval isn't only mini whiteboards or quizzes, right? I mean, inquiry, in my estimation, when done well, is really powerful retrieval, because not only is it retrieving the answers, and as Christian Moore Anderson in his book Teaching Meaning would say, the importance of agreement, like does the student agree with the teacher and sort of the right answer, and that is important, but it's limited, right? So the issue of are they really making meaning of things? And I saw some young lady on Twitter, I think, she had come across Teach Like a Champion, and this is not meant to denigrate Teach Like a Champion, because I think there's probably some good things and practices there. She was so excited about the initial pieces, and she'd shared her lesson, and I said, okay, that's a great start. So how are you helping students make meaning and checking for their understanding? And she said something, well, I haven't gotten there yet. And I'm like, well, hopefully you get there, but my fear is that it'll sort of be limited to that sort of knowledge acquisition phase. And I so rarely hear the ways in which they're then getting into, something that's more deep or transfer learning.
Yeah, absolutely. We did some research at the Institute of Effective Education back when I was still teaching, looking at what was making effective retrieval practice in our classrooms and trying different ways of doing retrieval. And we found the biggest effect size were coming from the classes where we weren't simply asking for a repetition of a particular answer, but the questions were just a little bit more developed. It's not just, for example, where in the world is it hottest, but why is it hotter on the equator? So it's kind of, it's still retrieving their memory of why it is hotter on the equator, but it just involves a little bit more thought to arrive at that answer, to be able to explain that answer rather than just on the equator. Because anyone can write on the equator without really understanding what the words on the equator means.
Right.
Just having to say, well, it's hotter on the equator because the curvature of the Earth and the insolation rate. It means you have to go through a few more cognitive steps to get there. I think that's important. But it's that kind of thing that can be missing, and that kind of nuance that gets lost. And it just becomes, you should start with a quiz, or you should use mini whiteboards.
Yeah.
How should you use them?
Right.
The kind of learning that we want pupils to have.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is a sort of lingering question, sort of on background on all of this, is we're talking about the sort of synergy of these three things requires a teacher to be quite skilled, right? And while we want all of our teachers to be quite skilled, not all of them are. And I'm not sure that it's reasonable, at least at this point, to expect that all of them will be highly skilled, even though that's what we want. And I'm sympathetic to the argument that if we have to sacrifice anything, that we should probably focus on the sort of cognitive science mode of the three that you've mentioned, because if you do inquiry and do it really poorly, I think it's true that it's very likely going to be disastrous. Probably something similar with dialogue. But if you're doing cognitive science really well or reasonably well, even if it's sort of formulaic and algorithmic, that at least the students will have a better probability of sort of having some knowledge, and the sort of downstream effects of that will be less negative. Do you agree with that? If you had to choose one of the three, would you choose the cognitive science one, or punt and say none of the above?
Wow, what a question. I would say, I think, I haven't really considered it before, but I think I would say the cognitive science approach is the one that I would suggest using, particularly for new, novice, and experienced teachers. I think it's likely to be, I think it's easier to set up the practices are set up well, so you can create those playbooks that tell teachers exactly how to do things, and if they do them in that way, it's likely to cause a minimal amount of harm. It is hard to do dialogic teaching and to do inquiry well, particularly if pupils don't have the kind of knowledge that comes from the cognitive science. But it's a horrible question. I mean,
sorry.
It's keeping the bar low, isn't it? But you're right. It is the situation we're at. Teacher turnover in most of the world is incredibly high.
Right.
It's hard to get experienced and excellent teachers to stay in the profession and to keep doing these things. People move on to go and find more profitable and less stressful jobs.
Yeah.
So sadly, that probably is the situation. So yes, I think if I had to just focus on one of them, it would be cognitive science. But let's not stay there. Let's, as a profession, let's aim a little higher, and let's go, what next? And I think what next is creating a curriculum based on this idea of powerful knowledge, and then finding a pedagogy that helps to support it, so that we don't just have year after year of novice teachers coming in, being given a playbook, working through the playbook, kids coming out with an okay education at best, but a little bit switched off and unable to do very much with it. And the cycle just repeats.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to that as well. Even though I would say I'm an inquiry advocate, but we have to be realistic, and I think that's a
Yeah.
realistic take. Unfortunately,
It's a
what?
downbeat end to a podcast episode, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so I'll give you any last words, any bright things you want to say, any things we didn't talk about, any things you want to mention that we haven't, and of course, where should people find you, and anything else that is relevant in that realm.
So I suppose the thing that I'd probably just kind of finish on is that kind of point that the pedagogy has to support the curriculum. And so the two have to be in dialogue with each other. So we need to think about the kind of curriculum that we want, and then we can have the pedagogy that helps to support it. And the two things have to align. And I think that's probably another conversation and kind of a bigger piece of work. I'm fairly easy to find. I'm not on social media as much as I used to be, but Mark Enser is a relatively unusual name. So I'm quite easy to find on LinkedIn. Every so often I pop onto X and see what's going on there, and usually leave quite quickly, but you can DM me there and send me a message and I'll probably pick it up eventually. But otherwise, LinkedIn's probably the easiest place to find me.
And your Substack.
I love to chat. Oh, and of course, Substack. Yeah. Teaching It Real. Find that, subscribe, do all the good things. That'd be great.
All right. We'll put a link to all of those things in the show notes. So if folks want to find him, that'll be the easiest way. Mark, I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate the work. I wish we had more to disagree about, but I guess that's just the reality of it.
That's the dialogue. That's good.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.